Today, we discuss Miro. Today, I want to talk about the hellscape that is technical diagramming, right? Everybody's nodding their heads right now, And there is a potential solution that I want to share. There was one name that several people brought up. I did some digging, and it's kind of nuts how much this program Miro has for developers. I have to share this. It could potentially be a game changer for you. So my favorite part about Miro is that half the work is already done. Like right now, typically we spend hours starting diagrams from scratch, gathering information. You get buy-in from every team. That's a lot of work to do. But Miro has a full set of integrations with the tools you're probably already using. And they also offer open APIs and SDKs for custom solutions for all those niche diagramming use cases we have to do, right? So the end result is the same, but it doesn't take forever. It's a massive, massive time saver. I'm transforming basic flowcharts and network architectures, and it all lives in one place. So are you using Miro? Have you used it? I want to hear. That's MIRO.com.
Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Hello, this is Stefan Bienkowski from the podcast with just a quick message before we get into the main show to let you guys know that we recorded this week's show hours before the DFB decided to part ways with Oliver Bierhoff. And although that doesn't extremely date the show, we obviously can't make reference to it because we didn't know it was about to happen. Having said that, we still think a good 95 or to 99% of the show is extremely relevant. So we haven't really changed much, but I just want to let you guys know that we are aware that Bierhoff has left the DFB, but at the time of recording, we did not. Enjoy the show.
Ich warte seit Wochen auf diesen Tag und tanz vor Freude über den Asphalt. Als wär's ein Rhythmus, als gäb's ein Lied, das mich immer weiter durch die Straßen zieht. Komm dir entgegen.
Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. We're allowed to say that again because this is a Bundesliga podcast, not a World Cup podcast. The World Cup is over for Germany, more or less. But I'm Manuel Veth. He's Stefan Bienkowski. Stefan, how's it going? Safe to say we will have to talk about the World Cup a little bit today.
Yeah, but with a little less anger and frustration in our voice, perhaps. A little less ranting, too. We've had a good weekend off, had a few beers, a few glasses of wine, got to relax. I went for a big, country walk. I was in the forest for about 3 hours on Sunday, just debriefing myself, and I was like, okay, I'm now finally ready to talk about German football again without, wanting to rip a small puppy apart, which is always good. No, I never got that bad, but yes, ready to take things with some fresh perspective again.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We had a chat on WhatsApp on Saturday where I was like, we're talking about the underlying numbers, and you just said to me, chill. And I did exactly that. I jumped on my bike and went for a 2.5 hour bike ride in almost 0 degrees weather. It's cold, but it was really good for my head, just to clear it all out, have some thoughts about everything that's going on. But also I think sometimes perspective matters, right? You put like a good 48, 72 hours behind. That's why we did the reaction podcast right away after the game. I think that's really important to have those fresh thoughts, but then also to put everything into perspective. And I think that's almost as important as like a fresh show right after, like a reaction, right? I think going back and then looking at it again and sort of with a new perspective on it kind of helps. At least that's how I feel. How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did kind of talk about things over the weekend, and it was quite intriguing to watch the media kind of react to it, and how the German media have just been kind of covering the World Cup since Germany got knocked out. I thought it's actually quite telling that there's been so much intrigue in Jude Bellingham and how well he's doing for England. I think it was Phil Foden who maybe said after the game that he could become one of the best midfielders in the world. and it was covered in a lot of the German press as if he was actually German. You know, it's quite intriguing. I thought that was quite interesting. But he's obviously a big ambassador for the Bundesliga, and without Germany there, I guess a lot of the attention does fall on him. But yeah, we're not here to talk about Jude Bellingham. He's doing very well, but he'll have plenty of people talking about him. So yeah, it's just. I think it's really interesting just to kind of now discuss the fallout from that World Cup and the kind of battles that have been happening in Frankfurt and the DFB and stuff since then.
Yeah, lots to go over. We should do all of that right after this break. This episode of the Gegenpressing podcast is brought to you by Bet Online. Basketball is back, and Bet Online remains your number one source for all your sports betting needs this season. You'll always find the latest odds, team matchup info, player news, and game trends at Bet Online. And is your continued source for all sports wagering information. Bet Online features live betting, free contests, and giveaways all season long. Always the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite sports and events, whether that's NFL, NBA, NHL, MMA, tennis, boxing, or even golf. Head to betonline.ag to join and receive your 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. Make sure to promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, to receive your rewards. That's it, BLEAV, to receive your rewards. Bet Online, where the game starts. Battles is a good term for that, actually. I had a moment to think about it during that short break here. Battles is a really good way of doing it. It's kind of interesting, before we dive into it, I find it really interesting how the DFB, the Deutsche Fußballbund, the Football Federation, right? And the DFL, the Deutsche Fußballliga, the entity that runs the first and second division in Germany, so the Bundesliga essentially, right? The Bundesliga is the first and second division. Just want to make sure these terms are clear. So the DFB is the Football Federation, the DFL is the Bundesliga. But what I find is really interesting, those two entities are completely separate, technically, right, Stefan? But Germany exits the World Cup. And it feels like these entities are completely intertwined. Everything that's been going on over the last 72 hours since Germany's World Cup exit seems to be completely intertwined in German. We have this nice saying, der Fisch stinkt vom Kopf, you know, the fish always stinks from the head, or rots from the head is another translation for it. And it seems like this is one where the heads of German football seems to be the ones rolling first. And this isn't just at the federation level, but also at the league level. And I find the one thing that's really kind of starting to come out here is that the DFL might fire their current president, Donata Hopfen, who was just appointed as Christian Seifert's replacement less than a year ago, because of the way the league is unhappy, the way the league has been handling the digitalization process, right? But also some statements that she made regarding 50+1, and I think the biggest blunder was the one about maybe putting putting league games in Saudi Arabia, right? But it's interesting because when this news broke, I've actually spoken to a few people working for German clubs over the last few weeks as part of my US trip. And I'm not going to say who it is, but you know, everyone I spoke to, everyone seemed to be kind of unhappy with how the league was led. Yeah. And everyone just said, look at how Christian Seifer has moved into a different role, now working with smaller sports, how he's quickly reforming those smaller sports, how he's putting them on a strong digital footing, how he's able to share content on social media. And this was actually one thing that was brought up, and something that we have actually complained about. Quite a few people have complained about the fact that you can't share digital content on social media platforms, Bundesliga content, right? And it seems to be a huge disappointment on how the game is spread. And I find it interesting that now...
Sorry, Manu, just to jump in there, it's an important thing that I think a lot of German football fans don't realise. Not only can you not share content from games, from German football games, Bundesliga games on social media, but the league has invested in a digital company that actively seeks out people who upload these things and gets the tweets deleted and potentially your Twitter account banned. So it's not easy. It's not even as if, you tweet out, "Wow, look at this goal that Kramer scored for Hoffenheim this week," and you tag the Bundesliga or something, and then they, when one of the guys on the lunch break just reports it. They have invested huge sums of money in a digital company to ensure that these things don't happen, which, is just draconian in my opinion. But anyway, sorry, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting that you bring that up because you talk to people that work within the DFL. A lot of people have left recently, right? Including in people in leading positions to join Seifert in his new endeavor, which tells you a lot, I think. Everyone was kind of forward thinking, and what I've been told, the feeling in the atmosphere in Frankfurt has been one of very old school, conservative, not very progressive. And so I guess that is now where the league is kind of realizing that they have to change a few things. I did like some of the ideas that were brought forward by Donata Hopfen. We talked about this, the idea that you maybe instead of bringing in foreign investment or investment into the individual clubs, that you kind of circumnavigate 50+1 and sell the rights packages instead, because they own all the rights packages throughout, right? Not like other leagues. Some of the other leagues have already sold off some of these packages. The Bundesliga has not.
Although they are talking about that, though.
Sorry?
They are talking about doing what La Liga have done, for example, in terms of selling off the future rights. But yeah, sorry, continue.
And that would have been something in the region of 20 billion euros, right? Which would be a huge cash injection for the Bundesliga and the individual shareholders, which is the 36 clubs. I did like that idea because it's probably easier to sell that than to tell the individual Bundesliga teams and their massive fan bases to bring in foreign investment. And interestingly enough, it almost feels like maybe that the clubs are asking now for more permission when it comes to 50+1. Freddy Bobic was someone really outspoken of maybe curtailing 50+1 is one of the people apparently involved in this palace revolution at the DFL. So that's a good way of putting it. But as all of this comes on the back of the national team exit, right? And I think what's really fascinating about that is that we might have had this anyways, but I think this exit accelerated everything, Stefan, because all of a sudden all of German football is in a crisis mode. German football, and I think you want to speak about that in a bit as well. There has been things put in place already as early as 2018 after the last exit to reform football in Germany. But I almost feel like before we even get to the DFB, I think the clubs, this was a good shot at them to just say there is something really basically wrong about the way the league operates, about the way talent is produced, and the way German clubs are falling behind in comparison to other leagues. And I think maybe this is just accelerated everything here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think what we've basically had here is obviously, nature in which Germany have been knocked out of the World Cup has been quite embarrassing, to put it lightly. And it has reflected very poorly on German football. I think there's a few interesting things going on here. I think the reason the DFL have been dragged into this is because the DFB, so essentially the German FA, I think, have wanted to kind of emphasize that everyone has to take a share of the blame here. And by that, they mean it's all well and good that you guys can criticize us for the coaches that we hire or the coaches that we don't sack in time or, the tactics that Hansi Flick plays or the players that he calls up. But, at the end of the day, we're not producing good enough players. And I thought Hansi Flick was actually quite good at almost cryptically making this point clear when he singled out Jamal Musiala as, the one player that he thought, not only the one player that he thought got through a tournament with pass marks, but he also heralded him as the kind of future of the German national team and how German football has to produce more players like that. And for anyone who works behind the scenes in German football will know that what he's basically saying there is the way that we have been producing players isn't good enough, and we have to stop producing players, quote unquote, German players, perhaps in the very modern sense. I'll say that, not in the classic sense. These very simple, templated, tactical, technical players who can all play very, clever, not very clever, sorry, but very safe technical football. And what he was basically saying there, or what was alluding to there, was we need more kind of risk takers, we need more flair players, we need more wingers, we need more forwards, we need more fullbacks. And basically, the entire system that German football is built upon, as in, the much celebrated youth academies and youth teams and youth coaches, he's like, that all has to change. And this is something that we've talked about ourselves on this show over the last season or so. We've been blowing the trumpet, or ringing the alarm bell for the lack of genuine coaches that are coming through. I think and these coaches these coaches all come from the same place as the players. They'll come from the youth academies, and you only have to look at the top 6 sides in German football, and you'll see that just about every single one of them relies on flair players from abroad. They rely on central defenders from abroad. They rely on forwards from abroad for the most part. It's only certain kind of positions that the German academies are actually pushing players through that play well in. So that's why I think the DFL have been dragged into this, because the DFB want to make it clear that it's not just our fault. We can only work with the tools that we have, and the tools that we are handed come from the youth academies in German football. My newsletter tomorrow, and thank you for alluding to it, so I can kind of get this plug in, will look at the changes that the DFL have been put, or rather the DFB have been trying to put into place, and have been trying to get the clubs themselves to follow, and that emphasis, and that's a very clear emphasis on more or less ripping up a lot of what was established during what has been come to known as Das Reboot, and how things have to change, and how going forward the kind of players that Germany will hope to produce will actually be very different from the players that currently are in this national team. So I think that's really important. I can't really add anything to the Hopman story because it's not something that I've really been chasing at all. I know you have, but the only thing I would say is that we have seen a lot of kind of club CEOs speak out over the last year and a half over the overall running of German football. I remember I interviewed Fernando Caro, who's the Bayer Leverkusen CEO, for The Guardian last year, and he was very, very vocal about the lack of innovation and the lack of kind of creative thinking in terms of trying to sell the Bundesliga's TV rights abroad. He was basically saying it's all well and good that Germany has 80, 90 million people who they can sell domestic rights to, but when it comes to international rights, the Bundesliga really struggles in that regard, and he's saying just not enough work being done in that. There's also been, and I think it's also the Union Berlin chief executive as well, if I'm not mistaken. I'll see if I can maybe pull up his comments. Here we go, actually. Oliver Runert said, the whole system just doesn't fit anymore. We are in a bad position in the DFB as a whole, in the national team from top to bottom. In the youth area, we have, in my opinion, made many wrong decisions in terms of personnel and structure for years. When you talk about personal consequences, you also have to consider the management level. You have to address that clearly. So he's very clearly pointing the finger at DFB there, so that's a little different from the DFL and Hopman. And I do appreciate if listeners right now are struggling with all these abbreviations, but the only thing I'd really add to this, and it's also something that we've talked about before in general, is that there is, in my opinion, a general kind of malaise in terms of how comfortable and how many people are comfortable at certain clubs in German football. These clubs are often, because they're run like membership associations, and because, people are voted in and they keep their jobs, and because there's all these kind of bureaucratic structures in place, there are a lot of people who are on boards and pulling the strings at some of Germany's biggest clubs, and they have been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years, and they're almost entirely immune from success or failure on the pitch. You can reference a number of clubs in this regard. Hamburg are the most obvious one to me. Schalke are another one. Two humongous clubs who, over the last 15, 20 years, the people that run them haven't actually changed that much, And I think basically what this Union Berlin chief executive here is saying is the DFB is no different in that regard, because if you look at the people who have been running the DFB, Bierhoff's probably the most obvious example of that. I know he's not the very top dog there, but he's obviously plays a huge role. He's there regardless of success or failure. And I don't think that's a DFB problem. I actually think that's like a German football culture thing, which maybe comes from just German corporate culture in general. I don't know. You'll be able to speak to that a lot more than I will, because I only lived in the country for a certain period of time. I only have so much experience with the German companies. But I think that's really interesting. So that's like the only other thing I'd really add to that.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I think the DFB, and a lot of people have to remember this too, the DFB is similarly structured than the German federal state, which is why it's called the Deutsche Fußballbund, like similar to the Bundesrepublik, right? A federal government, which is very different than what's going on in the UK, for example, right? But the Landesverbände, which is the different regional football associations, it's kind of similar to anyone who watched the FIFA-gate Netflix documentary and the voting thing, the way every association has like a voting right? The DFB is almost like a mini version of that. And that the different Landesverbände, so the different state-level organizations all have a vote, right? Which is why you had a guy like Rainer Koch, who was the head of the Bavarian Football Association, in there, mingling in there for years, and he's kind of the equivalent of Jack Warner for the DFB. But because it's a really powerful football association, right, within Germany, and these football associations have a lot of power. And so it's not just the very top there, but it's also these different associations below. And that can be a strength, because these different football associations then have the power to navigate and work in and help the youth football, right? Youth football development. And that means different clubs, single clubs within that entity have a lot of power in terms of voting upright. But it also means that the bureaucratic processes can be longer. And then if you have a bunch of foul apples in there, they will poison all the other apples, and it's really hard to reform, because it's a large entity. It's a body with 7 million members overall, right? And it's the largest football association in the world. So that makes the way it is operating, with like everything in Germany. You live there. I'm from there. A lot of the strength comes from the Mittelstand, the fact that there's like a middle body that's very strong. There's not really big companies at the top, and there's not very many small companies. There's this strong thing of middle companies, which can be a strength, but can also be a weakness depending on what kind of situation you're in. And you're seeing sometimes when it comes to reforms, Germany is very slow. You see it with everything. You and I spend lots of time there stuck on trains, because it takes Germany forever to reform something. The bonus is once a reform process is started and fully underway, they usually do it quite well. It's just slower, but it's more thought through. And I think this is what we're seeing with the DFB. I think a lot of the reform processes were started in 2018 when they exited the World Cup, right? But these things take time. I remember when Germany exited the Euros in 2000, they somehow managed to reach the World Cup final in 2002. I think all the karma that they had then, they used it up for those two World Cups. I kid you not, because that 2002 team was terrible. But it took until even the 2006, when Germany hosted, none of these players really were part of the reform process started in 2000. It wasn't really until 2010 that it started to impact the way Germany was playing, right? So 10 years. A proper reform takes 10 years.
And not to mention that a lot of the players in that team wouldn't have actually been able to represent Germany if not for, you know, reforms in immigration law and, you know, dual citizenship and things years before that. So, I mean, I know that's not really a footballing point, but it's also worth mentioning when you talk about bureaucracies and reforms.
Mm-hmm. It's actually important that you bring it up because that was something that when 1998 France won the World Cup with a bunch of players with an immigration background, that's when Germany looked at immigration law.
Yeah.
So that's actually, you know, and I think it's always interesting. The German national team is always kind of like a very good representation of the country as a whole, right? In 1954, Germany won the World Cup, and it was on the back of the Wirtschaftswunder. In 1974, it was on, you know, Germany winning the World Cup because they were playing this beautiful, Gladbach and Bayern were playing this really beautiful football. In 1990, it was reunification. In 2014, it was the country becoming cosmopolitan. The exits, unfortunately, 2018 and 2022, I think that is a symbol of stagnation that Germany has as a whole after 16 years of Merkel. You know, the government is in a complete crisis mode because of what's going on in Russia and the banking on wrong economic partners. And so the German national team has always kind of been like a copy of what's going on in real life in Germany. Yeah. And I think, like everything else in Germany, everything right now is being second guessed. Yeah. And looked at and changed, and I think this is what's going on with the national team as well, and it's going to take time. Yeah. I think. I think the only thing I'd really add to that is just that I completely agree with you, and you can even narrow it even further by saying the German national team is always going to be a reflection of how strong German football is. You know, that team that won the World Cup was off the back of very strong Bayern Munich and very strong Borussia Dortmund sides. You know, two sides that got to the Champions League final, and of course that, you know, the Dortmund side got pulled apart. But at the time, they were two very strong sides competing in German football. And, you know, even though Bayern Munich are still a very strong team at the moment, they're not really propped up by strong German players. Don't get me wrong, there are good German players on that team. You know, you've got Kimmich, you've got Musiala, you've got Goretzka, etc. But it's also a team that relies on almost an entirely French backline, you know, and a non-German striker. So even looking at that Bayern Munich team highlights the problems that Germany have as a nation in terms of the players they produce. And the bigger issue, I think, as well, is it's something we've talked about as well, is the difference between what was happening when Germany won the World Cup and what's happening now is that the teams below Bayern Munich just aren't anywhere near the same level as that Dortmund side were. And, you know, and I think that's an issue as well. I think you have to look at the quality of the opposition in in the Bundesliga, and, you know, whether these teams are actually able to use German players to, you know, whether they're able to produce good enough German players to play in the German national team. Because if they're not, you then get situations where guys like Kai Havertz leave the Bundesliga and they end up at Chelsea and they end up a little lost, and they're not quite sure what's going to happen, you know. And there's about 3 or 4 players in that national team who should be doing a lot better, but for one reason or another, their career hasn't gone quite the way it wanted to. But anyway, that's just a kind of final point on it. I think the national team reflects on the health of the domestic league and vice versa, and I think both of them are kind of in a sense in a crisis. The national team one's very obvious because they've just failed, but I think, and we talk about this on the show more often than not, so I'd like to think our listeners are informed on these topics, but when it comes to, you know, 50+1, or the amount of money that the Bundesliga makes from TV rights compared to the Premier League, or the number of players leaving the league to go play in the Premier League and how these teams get hollowed out, the league is also, in a sense, in a crisis as well. So maybe that's and COVID
why
really hurt too.
Yeah,
right. Because they were one of the last leagues with attendance back.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so it's why the DFL and the DFB are, you know, at each other's necks right now.
Yeah, I also think that the one thing, and I think this is really important to add, I think this team is better than a group stage exit, and I think the team in 2018 was too. the counterpoint to that is we had German national teams go all the way to the final that we really had no business being there, which actually is an important point. And I mean, we kind of chatted a little bit about that in WhatsApp. I think all the underlying numbers show that this Germany team should have made it out of the group, right? That this team is better than the results. But the problem is too that you don't have, and this is, you pointed this out, you have a lot of quality players that are not performing up to the highest level right now. And that is a part of the problem, right? Why is it that a Kai Havertz is not performing to his level? Why is Julian Weigl one of the most promising midfielders that we had in a generation playing at Gladbach and is struggling there? Why is Julian Draxler now trying to recircle his career at Benfica, right? There's so many players that are not even part of the squad, right? That are just trying, that seem almost like a lost generation in a way, even though they obviously have the talent. Like, I don't think these players are bad players. I think these players are actually really quite excellent. But for some odd reason, they just don't perform. And I think that is actually needs to be part of this discussion. Is like, why are we producing good players that can't perform?
Yeah, exactly. And it's something we're just going to have to keep an eye on as this story unfolds, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think it's kind of good that we revisited this. Looking back, I think we can sort of say now that Donata Hopfen, she is at risk of losing her position as president of the DFL. I think the DFB is going through in a complete reshuffling and crisis mode at the moment with everyone in question, including Oliver Bierhoff. Hansi Flick looks like he might be safe, Stefan, because of the short time that Germany have from now until the Euros, right, which is essentially just 18 months. I just had one final thought before we get going and talk about some of this other stuff. But if I had an ideal head coach, and I spent some time thinking about, who I would like to see take over the German national team? Louis van Gaal. Louis van Gaal. I think he'd be perfect. He's more German than Germans.
Yeah.
But he is like so different in his approach. And look what he's doing with this Dutch team. He's completely resurrected that country in terms of football. And they're playing the way that Germany used to play. It's pragmatic, it's efficient, and it works. And they might go all the way under the sky.
Yeah, I think that's a nice idea. I think, unfortunately, Van Gaal has his health issues at the moment. And he's actually was linked with the Belgium job, I believe. I think he was maybe flirting with the idea at a press conference.
Need to step in and get him.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not quite sure he'd be the best long-term solution, but no, he's obviously it's nice to see him doing very well with the Netherlands. But no, it'd be really interesting to see what he could do with this team. But I think as you said, I don't think Flick's going anywhere.
No, I just think, but it doesn't need to be Van Gaal. It needs to be someone like him. And I really remember Louis van Gaal invented modern Bayern Munich. The way that Bayern Munich played under, Heinkes and Pep Guardiola and all that, Van Gaal invented that.
Yeah.
And, he is, I know he doesn't have the best reputation because of his time at Manchester United in England, but I think he's an amazing head coach. That's just my final thoughts on this. And I think Germany would do quite well under him. But okay, so speaking of head coaches...
Yeah.
You want to talk about the Stuttgart thing first or the Dortmund thing first?
Let's do Stuttgart, and then just.
Oh yeah, and I need to do a correction from the last show. As one of our listeners pointed out on Twitter, Borna Sosa and Nicolas Gonzalez were signed by Reschke and not Mislintat. So, well done. Thanks for pointing that out. Absolutely 100% spot on. That was my mistake. And thanks for letting us know. I really appreciate it, because if we get something wrong and you find out, we're the first to admit that we got something wrong. So we got that wrong, but Mislintat no longer, Wimmer no longer, because Bruno Labbadia is becoming both sporting director and head coach. So it's a double recycling.
What a guy. Two for the price of one.
Yeah.
Do you think?
I don't know how.
Do you think he just Do you think maybe he just stopped by for a coffee one day? Like he was visiting some family in Stuttgart. You know, he's obviously from the area, so he's just maybe visiting his mum or something. And he's like, I'll pop by the old club, see how everyone's doing. And he walked out 30 minutes later, and he's like, did I really just sign up to be the new sporting director and head coach? They're just handing out jobs there. Nobody wants to be in charge. They're just handing out jobs. It just nothing kind of screams we don't know what we're doing quite like giving a former, you know, I don't want to say a former great or just like a, you know, a head coach who, with the greatest respects, probably over the hill in terms of what he's going to achieve in the game. Just giving him not one but two jobs. And I was kind of looking at Kicker's kind of coverage of this, and I thought it was quite interesting that they were basically saying that they had initially gone for different head coaches. They'd gone for Jes Thorup from Copenhagen and Alfred Schroeder from Ajax in October, but for one reason or another, those hadn't worked out. And then, you know, the interim head coach, Michael Wimmer, has actually done all right in the job, so he's stuck around. But I don't know. I just don't know where to go with this, to be perfectly honest with you, because it just screams.
So I need to make one small correction here. Like, apparently the new sporting director is Fabian Wohlgemuth from Paderborn.
Right, and then so Labbadia he's just the head coach.
Yeah.
Right, and wasn't he being linked as the sporting director a few weeks ago, or have I completely misread this?
He was originally supposed to be the sporting director.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not going mad. Okay.
No, you're not.
So,
you're good. This is a changing situation. Like, news are coming in as we record.
Right, so. Okay. It's very bizarre. It's who knows what's happening in Stuttgart, and we've now basically got a whole pre-season and January transfer window to go through, which will be actually quite interesting because it will give Stuttgart the time and the space to show us exactly what they are now. You know, they'll have the time to sell and buy players. They'll have the time to rebuild that squad if they can, or they'll have the time to completely implode.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do with all their open transfer questions, because I think now they need to bring in a guy who's basically starting from scratch, right? And I know there's time. Wohlgemuth. Paderborn is actually one of the better run teams in German football.
Yes.
Grösche came from there as well, right? Who was briefly at Leipzig and now in Frankfurt. Has done quite a good job there. So like this is one of the better run smaller teams in German football, and they do tend to produce people that then go on and are successful elsewhere. So that's a positive. I mean, Steffen Baumgart from Köln was there as well. So yeah, it's a small club, but they seem to be doing a lot of things right. And I'm just curious how Bruno. I like this image that you just produced. He's like just coming over for coffee, and he probably sat down with Sami Khedira and Philipp Lahm, and who are now in consultation roles there, right? And he's like, "Oh well, Bruno, why don't you do it?"
Yeah. Do you know what the craziest thing about all this is? They've given him a 3-year contract.
Oh my god.
There's no need for that contract. I mean, if it was Julian Nagelsmann, maybe you'd give him a long-term contract because you would think, well, it means if somebody comes and picks him up, we get some compensation for it. But it just means they're now lumped with having to pay him for the next 3 years when they inevitably sack him in 6 months' time. And I'm trying to remember which club it was. Is it Schalke who are still currently paying their last 3 head coaches?
God. Yeah, it's Schalke.
Is it Schalke? Yeah. And this is exactly...
They couldn't afford firing their head coach, remember that?
Yeah. But this... You know, this is what we talk about, though. This is what I was just saying in the last segment there about so many of these clubs are just so poorly mismanaged and nobody seems to get the sack for it. And this is we're now in real time watching this happen. You know, I mean, it would have been one thing if they were like, we're going to give it to Labbadia to the end of the season because we went for a few head coach options, and you know, for one reason or another, they didn't want to move to Stuttgart right now. So we know what Labbadia is all about. He knows the club. He's a local guy. The fans still have some appreciation for him. He's got an experience of fighting relegation, blah, 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 blah. Let's give him 6 months and just take it from there. Why the 3 years? What?
Yeah.
It's just, man, unless he obviously demanded it because he's like, well, when this all goes tits up, at least I get a payout. But I don't know. I don't know why. I'm not even a Stuttgart fan, but I'm getting so angry about this.
Yeah, I don't understand what 3 years seems like a long time for a head coach at a club like Stuttgart.
I don't even think
It's just...
I don't even think Edin Terzic and Marco Rosa, any of these guys have that contract set on. Maybe even Julian Nagelsmann, actually.
Yeah, most head coaches, unless they put in a clause that they can get out of the contract. But, what else bothers me about this is the people that he brings along. He brought on Bernhard Drares, former 1860 legend, played libero there. I'm aging myself. And Benjamin Sachs. So, people that have worked in this business for a long time. I get the whole idea of hiring a Feuerwehrmann, as they call them in German, right? A firefighter. So these are these coaches that you bring in to rescue your club, and then you move on to someone else. Peter Neuruhr was famous for this. It's kind of like the same as Sam Allardyce in England, right? And Labbadia has that reputation in Germany, but
Of course.
to hire a firefighter for 3 years is not with the club, not with the record that you have. Firing head coaches, it's maybe not the best idea. This gets me back to the point that these teams just can't help themselves.
No, they can't.
They just. If you were a real
Also-
business, they would at least all get fired.
Yeah, and it also makes you think about the sporting director who they've hired, who, to all intents and purposes, has done a good job at Paderborn. Did he sign off on Labbadia becoming his head coach for the next 3 years? Because
Yeah, that's a
that
good
plays
point.
that's a critical part in the sporting project he's probably now in charge of running. And he's like, well, what's the point in me scouting players, developing players, renovating the youth department if Bruno Labbadia is in charge for the next 3 years? And we're obviously being very hard on Labbadia here. He could do a perfectly good job, and he could save them from relegation, and he might.
But 3 years.
Yeah, 3 years. But that's the thing. Like, he could do a very good job, and he could get them up to 10th, maybe, and the mid-table side. And at that point, you then offer him a new contract.
Exactly.
There's
They
just
make it
there's just nothing.
performance-based.
There's just nothing about his recent positions in the Bundesliga that would suggest that he was deserving of a 3-year contract.
The only time he's done really well was the Wolfsburg.
Yeah.
He got them into the Europa League, right? He rescued them and then got them into Europa League. But even Wolfsburg only gave him then a 1-year extension, and then they moved on to Glasner, right? And so, yeah, it's one of those things. A well-run organization. Here's what a well-run organization, and I think this is where you are spot on. A well-run organization hires their sporting director first, gives that sporting director a long-term contract, and then gives that sporting director the time to find the right head coach, right? Because of the way German clubs are structured, that's how it works. It's not like in England where the manager is. I think, although in England increasingly the manager, there's some teams where the manager has less power now, right, than they used to.
Yeah.
But in German football, the manager is essentially the sporting director, and then the head coach just coaches. So what you do, a well-run club hires a sporting director, gives them all the power, and then that sporting director signs the players, brings in the right players, and then hires the head coach accordingly to that profile, right? So, and I don't feel like that's what happened here.
It just comes across as jobs for the boys.
Yeah.
Who knows anyone who'd be willing to take on this job? Like, oh, well, Bruno will do it, Well, only if we give him a 3-year contract. Like, oh, well, that's fine. We'll worry about that in 2 years' time. I mean, what happens? This is the thing. What happens if Stuttgart get relegated this season? Are they obliged to stick with Labbadia? Because
I guess so, unless there's a relegation clause.
Anyway, it's a very odd one. It's a very. I don't know if there's anything else I can add to it without getting angry. So I'm just maybe just gonna have to move on to the next.
Okay, so while you're angry, let's talk about Dortmund.
Oh, brilliant! That always calms me down.
Reports. You can tell Germany's out of the World Cup. Like all the media is now slowly but surely focusing back. First, your thoughts on Dortmund telling their national team players to go straight back to training after Germany's exit. That seems a little bit like Watzke, to go to our first topic today, already kind of like making power moves at the DFB.
Yeah.
At least that's how it felt like for me. I don't know how it feels like for you, but I'm like, okay, here's a guy who wants to get more influence at the DFB, kind of trying to lead by example. But also there's some reports that Edin Terzic, there's a lot of doubt now within the club about Edin Terzic. Surprise. No one saw this coming. I don't know. Just so the fact that they're now ordering all their players back, from on the backs of a poor World Cup performance. I also read, no, I didn't read. I heard from a source that Niklas Süle came to the Dortmund training camp this spring with 110 kilograms on the ribs.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff just going wrong there. That's my point.
Yeah, it's a concern. I mean, per Dortmund probably thought, this is fantastic. The season's up early. We can forget about that horrendous first half of the season. And the staff, the head coach, the players aren't at the World Cup. We can all go off to Vietnam, take some time off, get out of the heat, and they turned on the television for the first Germany game, and it's just a conveyor belt of Dortmund mishaps in defence. It's almost like Niklas Süle and Nico Schlotterbeck were almost this horrible duo from the gates of hell, determined to knock Germany at the World Cup single-handedly, and it has then led to basically so much pressure being not technically pressure put on Dortmund per se, but it's obviously going to have a huge impact on what Dortmund fans think about that squad going into the second half of the season, because they were two big marquee signings. We did like an emergency podcast when Süle joined for Dortmund because we thought it was such a big deal. Schlotterbeck as well, considered a huge big signing, and it's not even so much that they're out of form, it's the fact that they've been at a Dortmund side chasing shadows for the whole season, because Dortmund are an absolute mess under Edin Terzic. So it's almost like all their chickens have come home to roost, and all that's happened is that the misgivings and the mishaps in the Dortmund team have been exposed through the biggest spotlight that you can shine on anything in football, which is the World Cup. And it's just kind of led to Dortmund, well, once again having to Dortmund all over the place.
Yeah, I'm just curious how they're going to react to everything that's been going on. As you said quite rightly, I think they were probably hoping on the World Cup fixing some of their problems. And I mean, a lot of the things that I had a lot of people in my mentions saying this is Bayern's fault that Germany out of the World Cup early. I would actually say this is Dortmund's fault for not being strong enough, because the Bayern players performed by far and large, other than Neuer and the defenders in front of him, but which Süle and Schlotterbeck took a big part of. But I think that for German football to be better, we need a stronger Borussia Dortmund, and we need the Borussia Dortmund that makes right decisions. And I'm just not sure that Hans-Joachim Watzke has done a fantastic job fixing the club after they went almost bankrupt, led them to the titles in 2011 and 2012. But for the last 10 years, there hasn't been much to suggest that he is now the right person to lead the DFB or the DFL. And you see that with decisions that are made within Borussia Dortmund, right? The Edin Terzic appointment was brought in for Marco Rose because Marco Rose didn't feel like he was a proper part of the club, and the feeling wasn't good. They made decisions based on those are gut gut-based decisions. That's not how you run a modern football organization. You don't run that on a gut-based decision. That gut-based decision led to Marco Rose being fired, Edin Terzic installed, and Marco Rose leading Leipzig to 3rd place in the Bundesliga, and possibly more, right? You essentially strengthened your direct competitor because you woke up one morning and you had a gut feeling that it wasn't correct, that Marco Rose wasn't a good fit at your club.
And by the way, the reason that Marco Rose wasn't a good fit at Dortmund is the exact same reason that Thomas Tuchel wasn't a good fit at
Gut
Dortmund.
feeling.
Well, it's because they were pushing back against the club's overall business policy, which was we sign young players and we sell them when we want to sell them, and we don't put a huge amount of effort and time into the kind of, well, not that they don't put any effort and time in, I'm not suggesting that, but it's very hard to be an ambitious head coach at Borussia Dortmund these days, you know, and because there's an expectation that you have to spend money, you have to spend money to make money in football. You have to, you know, fake it till you make it to extent to get up the league tables. And every kind of ambitious head coach that Dortmund have hired since Jurgen Klopp has ended in failure because they just butt heads with that board for one reason or another. So Edin Terzic, as we talked about at the time, I called him a cheerleader. He's a club cheerleader to a large extent, which is it's not really meant to be a disrespect to him as a head coach, because it just points out that he's a novice head coach. He was hired well above his station, in my opinion. And I had concerns that he was hired just because he was basically a yes man to that board, because Dortmund can't hire head coaches who aren't yes men. But they're now, as you said, we're now getting to a position where the last head coach they sacked, instead of moving to PSG or Chelsea, has moved to their direct competitors. And this is exactly what would have happened if Thomas Tuchel had moved to, I don't know, like Bayer Leverkusen or someone at the time, and took them up the table. There would have been pressure on the immediate successor, and that's what's now happening with Terzic. So it seems like this was always inevitably going to happen. I don't really think they're going to sack him by any means, and I think they'll probably stick with him to the end of the season unless they start. They have to. Yeah,
they put themselves in a position where they have to. They have to stick with him because he's their guy.
Yeah. Which unless like you said, unless things drastically change during this kind of mid-season break, there's nothing to make me think that, you know, this Dortmund team are going to improve anytime soon.
You know, so the smart thing would have been to do it now.
Yeah, and give a new head coach now. At the time too.
All the headlines are on Germany and the national team and change at the DFB. You could have released some press statements saying, after long conversations, Edin Terzic and Borussia Dortmund have come to the conclusion that it would be better to hand over the direction of the club to a fresh set of eyes and new hands. Edin Terzic is going to move back into the echelons of Borussia Dortmund, work at the youth sector, the academy, blah, blah, blah. Here, I wrote them the press release even. You know what I mean? Like, this would have been the time to do it. You just sneak it in now.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said on the transfer podcast last week, they can then sign Jadon Sancho and all their problems would be fixed.
Yeah, sign Sancho and a good head coach. Okay, well, this has been a great show. I think we've gone through a lot of different topics here. I think we can now put a big check mark behind the World Cup. We're going to slowly move back towards the Bundesliga business again. I think maybe do a midweek show for subscribers, Stefan, on some of the how some of the Bundesliga players that are not part of the Germany team. That could be a good idea. Look at some of them. But yeah, please subscribe. Stefan's article is going to be out probably around the same time as this podcast. Then we're going to have a bonus show, and I'm going to come up with a nice article. So stay tuned for that. The show, as always, is brought to you by BetOnline. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up, Stefan?
No, just looking forward to the Bundesliga's return. Actually, I'm also looking forward to a winter break, which we should probably say we're probably going to take. We haven't really confirmed it yet, so I'm not saying when, but we will probably take a week or two off during Christmas and be back in time for next year. But we'll let you guys know well in advance.
Yeah, 100%. All right, that's that. Until next time, auf Wiedersehen.
Ende in Sicht.
Today, we discuss Miro. Listen, when it comes to running client workshops, the dream, of course, is to get those creative juices flowing, right? But typically what ends up happening is thousands of hours get wasted because of poorly facilitated meetings. So I have Maya with me today. She's a consultant who runs Fortune 100 workshops, from leadership training to team building, and she has the insider tip on what makes things work. Maya?
Thank you, Jason. I've been doing this a long time. My number one tip is to bring everyone into that visual collaboration platform. So personally, I use Miro, and it's completely changed how I interact with the room. You have to give people a way to feel like they're in the room even when they're not. That's something you can do easily in Miro. Otherwise, they've seen the same slides and format 1,000 times.
Falling asleep, eyes glazing over, yawns, all that.
Exactly. When people follow me on the Miro board, everyone is literally going on a journey with me. We're adding thoughts, we're reacting, and we're voting for the best ideas. It's great.
Connective magic. I like it. That's MIRO.com.